Back to the series on kinship studies. In continuation with the series, today I am going to talk about the cultural approach. And just before I begin on the cultural approach, let me just go back to the previous lecture. The previous lecture was on approaches to kinship study, in which I dealt with two major approach, which is the descent approach to study of kinship and the alliance approach. It is in continuation with this that we have the third approach, which is called the cultural approach. The cultural approach to study of kinship emerged as a critique to the descent and alliance approach. So the descent and alliance approach, say from the till the 1960s, were trying to draw a perspective to understand kinship society based on the understanding of blood and marriage relations. It was 1960s that there was a realization that what is left about kinship, and it is after this that David Schneider comes in and kinds of does a critique of kinship studies. And with his critique of the kinship studies in the 1970s, we have approach the cultural approach. The cultural approach is basically, we kind to understand in terms of evolutionary pattern. We see the descent approach was using blood and genealogical model to understand society. The alliance model critiqued the descent model and said that there are certain limitations in which we can only understand kinship relations based on blood, and therefore it was very important to kind of look into the relations which are based on marriage. After the critique of alliance, we see cultural trying to say that both descent and alliance or marriage relations are basically based on biology. So it is not necessarily that kinship is everything about biology. And as a critique of biology, the cultural approach became very significant. So in the first half of the lecture, I'll be talking about the approach as basically David Schneider's study of American kinship to understand what is cultural approach. And therefore, to begin with, if we like to try to understand that in the mid 20th century, the social anthropologists such as Malinowski, Ratcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Mayer Fortis, which I have dealt in the previous lectures, but just talking about kinship in terms of the simple society. So there was a kind of a comparison between the simple society and the complex society, and it was kind of argued that kinship is the basis of social organization of simple society, and it is the political order, the social order, the economic order are basically based on the kinship relation. It was the structure in places that lack a state organization, and so it was thought. So they basically, most of the, if we look into Ratcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, they were all looking into the structures of the society, and they were trying to bring in kinship, fit into the absence of politics and economy. So Evans Pritchard's study of Newer says that even in spite of a political structure, there is a kind of an order, which he calls it as anarchy, and therefore we kind of understand that this structure was very significant for the earlier approaches to kinship. Kinship was the political structure and the key to understanding the simple society. Early on, kinship was defined by anthropologists as variable, but the assumption was that there were large degree of universality and consisting of kinship pattern. So basically the task of the anthropologist were trying to do a comparison and classification, and on the basis of that they arrived at certain generalized or universal understanding, which was kind of assumed to be applicable to all society. So most of the anthropologists were trying to study the simple society in Africa, Australia, and kind of an understanding based on these simple society, grand generalizations were arrived at. In the earlier studies, when we look into the descent and alliance approach to the study, we see most of the anthropological work were androcentric. That is, there was an absence of women's perspective. Women were completely absent from anthropological account of kinship because the emphasis was on the colonialist project of trying to understand the forms of decision making among tribes. So that is the reason we see when Malinowski studied the Trobriand Island and he studied the Kula exchange, he is not at any point of time talking about what was the role of women in these Kula exchange. So there was a kind of a bias towards women because of the objective in itself was try to theorize or try to kind of arrive at a theory of simple society. 1970s, as I already said, we see a kind of a undoing of kinship. Undoing in the sense there's a major critique of what anthropologists were trying to mean when they was trying to study kinship society. And therefore, the 1970 onwards, we see the approach to kinship is beyond biology. That is, we cannot kind of arrive at something which is out there, given, compare, classify, and arrive at an understanding. We need to go deeper into the meaning of everyday interaction, and therefore there was a shift from something which is kind of everything restricted to biology, blood, genealogy, to something which is beyond it. And therefore, we'll see then after Schneider, we see new studies are coming in, where there are a lot of studies on gays and lesbians, and they are trying to understand that kinship is beyond biology. They do not standard of everyday in the construction of non-traditional family. So we try to, when we kind of bring in biology, they will see that there is a kind of a understanding of the institution of family, where family was considered, in Radcliffe Brown's term, a man of women and his sons and daughters, but it was a kind of a union, a sexual union, which would result in procreation. But if we look into the homosexual family, where there is no kind of a sexual union between man and a woman, and the purpose is not procreation, it still constitutes a family. So how do we look into these alternate forms of family which goes beyond biology? And the answer to this is that we kind of have an approach which is kind of away from what we actually mean by biology in the terms of blood and genetics. So the understanding of family and marriage began to include relation formed outside heterosexual, monogamous sexual union. So when we even look into the institution of marriage, the marriage was kind of understood as a kind of a monogamous union between a man and a woman for the purpose of procreation. But then there are certain forms of marriages which we'll see, even anthropological case of Nair society, which does not fit into the traditional definition of marriage, and therefore because of these limitations there was a need for a new approach to understand kinship, and therein comes in the cultural approach. The cultural approach, as I have already said, argues that kinship cannot be understood only with reference to biology. The reference to biology is nothing more than ethnocentric view of kinship derived from European culture. So this is a critique which kind of tries to say that they were trying to evolve at a universal model based on a certain notion of what kinship is, on certain notion of what blood meant, on certain notion of what kinship marriage meant, and therefore they kind of, it need not necessarily fit into every kind of a society. So there's a move from a universal kind of an understanding to a cultural specific society understanding of what kinship is. Kinship was to be understood with reference to cultural practice of everyday society, and in this context, when we see that when we differ from one society to the other society, the cultural practices, the everyday practice of relating, the everyday practice of sharing, everyday practice of kind of even feeding has kind of a different meaning, and that constitution of meaning of any action in everyday life was something which was a focus of the cultural anthropologist. Culture and not biology is to be considered as the real foundation of kinship. So the shift is from not trying to understand how a father is related to the son or the son is related to the grandfather, but the shift is trying to understand how the kind of negotiations takes place among themselves in order to constitute a family. And even if kind of there is an absence of certain kind of blood relation, what would such a kind of institution be termed as? It was the interpretation of the process of the biological process of reproduction and not simply the process that constitutes kinship. So here what becomes very significant is the meaning, a kind of attaching a meaning to a particular form of action. So in that context, what we understand by biology is also kind of a meaning which has been constructed in terms of certain generalized assumption. So that is being questioned here, and meaning changes from society to society. The social relationships are examined from the point of view of symbols in which relationships are embedded. So we kind of try to understand that, as Radcliffe Brown has also said, that the descent is both biology and social. Here the focus shifts on terms of understanding descent in terms of the relationship or the meaning that we are attaching. So, in a kind of a society in which there is a meaning attached to the role of the father, which becomes significant, it is an everyday outplay of that relation which becomes significant for anthropologists to study. According to cultural approach, kinship is a cultural or a social construct, and according to biological approach, kinship is a natural and given. So, here there is a kind of a distinction between the biological approach or the alliance approach, where the argument made by anthropologists was that kinship is out there, it can be kind of observed, it is natural, it is universal, it is found everywhere in the society in the same pattern. But according to the cultural approach, kinship is not something which is universal. Kinship is something which is culturally specific, and it is the meaning which is constructed in everyday society which becomes significant. And in that context, it is very important to understand what do we mean by culture. In the context of cultural approach, we see that cultural system was defined as based on shared symbols and meaning. So, the same kind of an action can be kind of given a symbolic meaning, and that interpretation of that meaning quite differs from one society to the other, and that is what becomes significant for a cultural anthropologist to kind of unravel the meaning which is kind of understood in everyday relations. Therefore, we see that the cultural approach was used to denaturalize kinship. So, that kinship was not something which was given out there. So, the whole idea was if it was there, out there, given, and it could be observed, then what about kinship? So, there every 10 to 1 to 3 decades of kinship studies, everything would have been studied. Therefore, it was kind to understand how do we understand variance, how do we understand change, how do we understand development. And therefore, we kind of create a disjunction between kinship and biology in order to have a more meaningful understanding of kinship in different society. So, here we go into the main proponent of cultural approach, which is David Schneider. David Schneider was a symbolic anthropologist who rejected the earlier understanding of kinship in pure biological terms. He kind of wrote a book in which he was kind of questioned what about kinship. So, there is nothing to be left to be done in kinship if it was only to understand the relation between the father and the son, and in terms of trying to understand the exchange of women. So, what was left in it? And therefore, he begins with a critique of the existing theories or the existing biological approach to study of kinship. For Schneider, norms, values and symbols were important to understand kinship as a cultural system. Biology as the basis of kinship is a Western notion, which is an abstract idea to be found only in the minds of anthropologists and not in the society which they studied. So, that is kind of even trying to understand what is biology. There is a certain kind of a way in which we understand biology, which could be kind of understood only by those who are involved in the analysis or study of it. Beyond that, people might not understand the meaning of it in the same manner as they had done it. So, he is kind of saying that it was an idea only which was present in the minds of the anthropologist and nothing to be found outside of it. So, therefore, he said kinship was abstract. His pioneering book, American Kinship, A Cultural Account, demonstrated that what we think in nature is nature in America, culture is actually cultural. So, he kind of trying to understand that meaning differs from one society to society. So, what would biology or what culture would mean in one society would not be the same in a different society. And in that context, he defined culture as a system of symbols and meaning, considered kinship as a set of symbols and meaning which needs to be interpreted. So, kind of trying to understand, when he tries to understand what in America family would, he will try to understand what is the meaning that the individual attached to it in order to understand the meaning of family. By challenging the definition of kinship in terms of certain concrete elements like relations by blood and marriage, Schneider took kinship away from genealogy and domestic domain. So, there was a kind of an understanding. If we go back to the descent or biological approach, we see that kinship was supposed to be the domestic domain or was supposed to be non-formal domain. Here there is an extension to it, so kind of problematizing it, that if we leave it to biology and to marriage, then it is only kind to be understood in the domestic domain. So if we kind of move it away from it, we need to take kinship outside of biology, or we need to move out beyond biology in order to kind of consider it as kind of a more formal institution. So his first major work was the critique of kinship study. He questioned the applicability of Western understanding of kinship based on unilineal significance of biology. He claimed that the theories propounded by Western anthropologists were limited in their applicability and could not be used to understand family and kinship in non-Western society. In his work, A Critique of the Study of Kinship, Schneider considers kinship as an abstract, as there is no such thing as kinship. So he said that it is only in the mind of the anthropologist who was kind of understanding it through the model of biology, but outside that domain, it kind of is nothing called kinship. Not in the sense of the universal model of the nuclear heterosexual family, in which marriage is a social expression of a biological law. So there was certain kind of understanding which was necessary for us to understand kinship. So there had to be a kind of a union between a man and a woman that was termed as a institution of marriage, which had the purpose, or which had the function of procreation, which would lead to the formation of a kind of a family. So if we move outside the definition of marriage, if we move outside the definition of family, then we kind of see that there is nothing called kinship. So if there is a family in which there is a kind of a homosexual union, or there is an absence of marriage, or in which the function of procreation does not take place, then the whole idea of kinship would false, or it could not apply to it, and it is therefore that Schneider called kinship as abstract. He argued that American anthropologists had a faulty foundation by assuming that the cultural value of blood is thicker than water. He believed common in their own society. So there was a kind of an understanding in which too much of significance was given to what was blood, and therefore we kind of even find in feminist understanding of kind of a personality formation of individual, where we have a kind of a metaphor between seed and the earth, where the seed is considered to be made from the blood of the father, and therefore the personality of the individual kind of falls onto the patrilineal line. But that is kind of an attaching too much of significance to something which is considered as blood, and in not all society the significance is of similar importance, and therefore there is a need to move away from kind of considering blood as so significant in the understanding of kinship. He goes on to argue that Euro-American models understand kinship as the social construct of natural, that is biological. He criticizes the social anthropologist on three accounts. First, they talk only of the biological aspect by focusing too much on the notion of blood and genetics in the terms of genealogy. Second, they were trying to study the magnitude of sharing. They are concerned only sharing and not sharing of biogenetic substance. So they kind of, there is no difference between structure and culture, though they are kind of focusing on the structure of the society, but in their analysis they kind of assume structure and culture as synonymous, and that is the kind of a distinction that needs to be kind of brought around. Structure in kind of is a network of relation, and culture in kinds of means norms, values or meaning that we attach to certain kind of relations. In his work, he makes a distinction between cultural and normative. He kind of defines cultural system as a system of units, parts which are defined in certain ways and which are differentiated according to three different ideas. The normative system consists in rules and regulations. So as we see, normative implies norms. So norms would be how are you going to do certain things? They are some kind of rule setting behavior. If the behavior is to be accepted by his society and community as proper, so they are how to do rules, how you go about behaving. So if it's a kind of a father-son relations, there are certain relations which can do, this is the way you behave with your father, this is the way you could kind of have a relations with the father. So that's normative system. where the normative system is egocentric and particularly appropriate to decision making of interactional model of analysis. Culture is system centered and appears to be more static and given and far less processual. So, this kind of culture comes in from the system itself. It emerges in everyday interaction. In the social system or the cultural system, cultural concerns the stage setting and the cast of character, whereas the normative system consists of stage direction for actor and the role that actor should play. So, he makes a very clear difference between what is cultural system and what is normative system. So, cultural system will be kind to tell you how you are going to behave in kind of certain society in terms of your behavior towards it, whereas the normative will tell you how to kind of go about every particular relations in the society. This is not to say that normative and culturals are unconnected. According to Schneider, the cultural level is a part of the normative level. The cultural premises provides us that there are two kinds of relations by blood and marriage. However, it is the normative pattern that provides the way through which we should treat those relatives. The study of kinship requires one to abstract from the normative system the cultural system. So, this was the method that he kind of advocated, that we have both the cultural system, which is a larger whole, and from there we need to abstract the normative. That is, we need to abstract how to do rules about, or how to kind of understand the behavior pattern of the kinship relation in order to understand kinship. And when we kind of go through his book, he is also making reference to the religion as an institution, education as an institution, to explain how kinship is like religion or education, in the sense it consists of part and whole. So, we need to kinship is only a part of a larger whole, and therefore, we need to understand the relation between the part and whole before we can arrive at an understanding of what kinship is. So, now we go into his study of the American kinship. While studying the domain of kinship in America, Schneider sees that it is only part of the larger domain made up of two different parts. To be in simpler words, for Schneider, kinship consists of two parts. One is the shared biogenetic substance or the blood, which is inherited natural substance. So, every individual kind of has a biogenetic substance, and the second, which we abstract from the normative system, is the code of conduct or moral order, which ensures solidarity among related members. The code of conduct, which will tell us how to do rules in society. So, he is saying that we need to combine the biogenetic system and code of conduct to understand the kinship relation. And he says when these the code of conduct and the biogenetic substances combined, we arrived at three categories of kin. So, when both elements occur together, blood relatives are formed. So, we have kind of blood sharing biogenetic substance as well as the code of conducts are there. These blood relatives are considered to be related in nature, and they are part of the natural order of things. So, the best example for the first category of kin would be the father and son relation. So, the father and son shares a blood relation, as well as there is a kind of a code of conduct which the two has to follow. The second kind of kin relations which comes out from the combination of biogenetic substance and code of conduct is code of conduct element occurs alone without shared biogenetic substance element. The category in relatives in law which we form through marriage, that is your in-laws, or relatives by kind of alliance, which is was considered in terms of the alliance approach. It is a part of much wider category of order of law defined in opposition to order of nature. So, in the second category of kin, we only have kind of code of conduct, that is kind of relation of a woman with the father-in-law or a mother-in-law. There is a code of conduct, there is no shared biogenetic substance. So, if you kind of look into Schneider, he has kind of said that what the biological approach was doing was only looking into the first category of kin, and the alliance approach was only looking into the second category of kin. Schneider gives us a third category of kin, which he says that shared biogenic substance is present alone, the category of relatives in nature is formed. So, we have kind of only relations with say for instance the relation between the mother and the son, there is only biogenetic substance, there is no code of conduct. For Schneider, however, kinship is not about sharing or not sharing of biogenetic substance, but how we share it, or rather the focus is how we kind of attach a certain meaning to that sharing. Thus, kinship relations can be reckoned by order of nature and order of culture. So, he makes a kind of a distinction between two kinds of order. One is order of nature, in which we have biogenetic substance, which we can, in a simple word, say there is kind of a blood relations. And the second kind of relation is the order of culture, in which we have a code of conduct. So, both the order and nature of culture has to be looked together, not as separate to each other, but together when we try to understand kinship. When we look into the contribution that the cultural approach has done to kinship, we can see that it has been a very significant to kinship understanding, because it led to the resurgence of anthropological studies that focus more on culture. These studies have been referred as new kinship studies. So, these are all studies after 1980s, which we can try to understand as new kinship studies, where the focus becomes more in terms of understanding, sharing, understanding relatedness, rather than just understanding the way in which one is related through blood. So, the new kinship study, as they explore the non-biologically rooted relatedness with focus on how kinship emerge over time through caregiving relationship and response to affirmative choice to create kinship ties. So, the entire contribution kind of a shifting kinship studies from a pure biological kind of understanding to kind of looking into kinship only in terms of differentiating between simple and complex society. The credit goes to Schneider for coming up with a cultural approach to kinship. The kind of when we look into the studies after Schneider, we see that the studies have highlighted the new and emerging forms of kinship in the West. Some of the issues brought into the body of kinship studies are instability and divorce in heterosexual marriage, the advent of same-sex marriage, gender equality, gay right, falling fertility rates, increasing number of people living on their own, and so on. So, we see that cultural approach has basically broadened the horizon of kinship study. We are just not understanding kind of a narrow box where we understand how one is related to other, where there is a blood running through, or there is marriage relations. There are a lot of issues which have emerged because in complex society. So, kinship becomes very significant to understand complex society in terms of understanding marriage patterns, in terms of increase in divorce rate, and also in terms of progress in science and technology, where technology has kind of changed the meaning of motherhood or maternity. So, we see the cultural approach basically to kind of shifting it from biology to culture has broadened the horizon of kinship studies. With this, I come to an end to the lecture on cultural approach to the study of kinship. Thank you.